All right, so now let me go to show my screen. Start broadcast. Okay, so I'm about to go live. I'm going to hit start broadcast. So anything we say to each other, everybody will hear.
Got it.
Okay, so I'm going to start the broadcast right now, and then I'll welcome everybody. And I have 12:29, so we can get started. We've got 34 people online, which is a pretty good number. So here we go.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the District 1 Regional Webinar. Today's webinar topic is product safety. It's part 1 of the 4-part series. And today's presenter is Ann Lardner-Stone, Director of Public Affairs for PPAI. And with that, I will turn it over to Ann to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to spend some time catching up on some of the product responsibility issues that we all have to grapple with in this day and age. What I'm going to try to do is go through some of the big product categories. As I indicated, and as Jonathan indicated, this is the first of a 4-part series. And it qualifies as the primary course in PPAI's Product Safety Aware program. Now, as many of you know, PPAI introduced the Product Safety Aware program in order to ensure that all companies seeking to do business with the promotional products industry through PPAI channels have at least a basic understanding of their compliance obligations. So we have 4 hours of product safety. This is the first session. It's Product Safety 101. It also is, if any of you are pursuing your MAS or CAS, it is a required course to take in order to achieve that designation. Next time, we're going to cover Prop 65 and state regulations. We'll cover undue influence, and then we'll do an elective course that talks about some of the other challenges associated with compliance. So without further detail, I think it would probably be best to get started. So if you go to the next slide, you're going to see it's a disclaimer slide of sorts that says this information is being provided for educational and informational purposes only. PPAI, if you're seeking really specific counsel, it's important that you contact either an attorney or a qualified testing lab. I'm not an attorney, but what I'm going to do over the next hour is try to cover the details of CPSIA to the best of my ability. So why don't we go to the next slide. And what we're going to do today is really try to cover what you need to know, why you need to know it, how you can get started. There are going to be a few slides that are pretty heavy in the details, and we'll go through those, but I promise that at the end I'm going to give you resources so that when you get back to thinking about this in a day or two and you don't remember the details, you'll know where to go to look them up. So if we could go to the next slide. What I want to do is set the stage a little bit and talk about why this is such a big deal with product responsibility. It wasn't so long ago that getting the right product to the right customer with the right imprint by the right in-hand state at the right price was enough. And now so much more pressure is being put on everyone in the industry. People want to know, how is this being made in a socially responsible way? Is it being made in an environmentally sustainable manner? And what are you doing about product responsibility? And it makes everything a lot more complicated. If you go to the next slide, what we're also talking about here is that we're in the brand protection business. When your customers give you their logo to put on a product, they're really trusting you to protect their good name. And some of the very biggest clients, they have a lot of pressure from their stakeholders and their customers, putting the pressure on them from the social and the environmental side. The other thing is that the compliance on the federal side is not optional. It's absolutely mandatory, and it's getting more demanding all the time. But on the plus side, it really can be a strategic value to you that by you understanding these rules and being able to comply with these rules, it's a strategic advantage to you, and it sets you apart from your competition that may or may not be fully versed in these responsibilities. So if we go to the next slide, when the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, which I'm going to speak to in a lot of detail first came out, everyone wanted to know, well, who's responsible? Who's responsible for making sure that the products are tested? And everyone really wanted it to be the other guy's job. You know, distributors are like, it needs to be the suppliers. Suppliers are like, no, it needs to be the distributor. At the end of the day, everyone is responsible. Distributors need to protect the customer's brand as if it's their own, to do your good due diligence, to exercise due care, to ask the right questions and share the answers with the supplier. Suppliers have to make sure that these products comply with all the regulations, and they have to be exercising their due care and their due diligence with the factories. And finally, at the end of the day, everyone's responsible. Education and awareness are critical, and that's what we're going to try to cover today. So if we could go to the next slide. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that when we talk about everyone's responsible, there are instances where the distributor actually becomes the supplier in the eyes of the law. The distributor is the supplier if the distributor is the importer of record. So if you source direct from overseas, regardless of where the overseas are, if you're the importer of record, in the eyes of the federal government, you are the supplier. Additionally, a distributor becomes a supplier if a distributor makes material changes to the product once it leaves the hands of the supplier. The perfect example of that is the T-shirt. So if a distributor gets a blank T-shirt, the supplier is the manufacturer of the T-shirt, obviously. But the distributor who sends it to the screen printer down the street just made a material change to the garment, and the distributor is the manufacturer for the imprint, if that makes sense to everyone. And we'll go over that more. And if you have questions about any of this at any time, just type it in the chat box on the screen, and we'll try to respond to it as we go through the presentation. So if you could go to the next slide. I love this quote. It's all substances are poison. The difference is in the dose. And in 2007, we had a bunch of problems with dosage. If you go to the next slide, we started, okay, so 2007, product safety circles, it's commonly called the year of the recall. One item after another seemed to be recalled in 2007. First, it was spinach. There was E. coli in the spinach, got a ton of people sick, and for months you couldn't find any spinach in the grocery stores. Next slide. Then it was peanut butter, and it wasn't just, you know, one brand of peanut butter. It was a bulk manufacturer of peanut butter who supplied the peanut butter that went in tons of products. Thousands of jars of peanut butter and other products that had peanut butter in them were recalled in 2007. Next slide. And then do you remember the melamine in the pet food? Melamine was added, kind of like it's a plastic item. It was added to peanut butter to boost the perceived protein in the pet food, and pets got sick and pets started dying. Next slide. Then easy bake ovens were recalled. So, you know, with the easy bake oven, you have the little light bulb in there that cooks the cake over the course of 4 or 5 hours. Well, unfortunately, that slot where the little baking tray goes into the easy bake oven was actually the perfect size for a child's hand to get in there, and sometimes they couldn't get them out. They got recalled because children were getting very serious burns from the easy bake ovens. Next slide. And then lead started happening. So Thomas the Tank Engines started being recalled because they tested the paint on the Thomas the Tank Engines and found high levels of lead in the paint. Next slide. And then poor Mattel. This was just ridiculous. Mattel had a terrible year. Basically, Mattel had a deal with their factories in China where they had 4 authorized suppliers of paint. And so they told all of their factories in China, you can source your paint from any of these 4 factories, not a problem, work with them easily. Well, one of the factories decided they wanted to go to a different paint supplier. So they went outside the approved vendor list for paint, got paint from somebody else, and that paint was loaded with lead. It was like something like 10 times the lead limit that was allowed in the U.S. So Mattel found out about this. Mattel started testing, and then things got really bad for Mattel. Can you go to the next slide, please? So August 2nd, they recalled 1.5 million Fisher-Price toys because of lead. 2 weeks later, they recalled 17.4 products because they had loose magnets that could pose a choking hazard. A couple weeks after that, they recalled nearly 1 million toys because of lead paint, a lot of Barbie products. Next month, they recalled more products because of high levels of lead in the paint. And they rounded out the year on November 6th with recalling more than 100,000 products because of choking hazards. So for Mattel, it was a terrible year. Mattel got blamed for a lot when it came to CPSIA, but the fact is that could have happened to anyone. It just happened to Mattel. They had the approved vendor. Somebody went outside the approved vendor list. They introduced the contaminant. Once Mattel started testing, they realized just how big a problem they had and had to recall a ton of products. So tons of publicity. Parents are up in arms, all sorts of special interest groups, and they're going to DC and they're saying, hey, you need to do something about this because our children are being exposed to a lot of dangerous chemicals. Can you go to the next? Because lead causes all sorts of neurological deficits in young children. So in 2008, Congress acted quickly and decisively and passed the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. Can you go to the next slide? So CPSIA is the single broadest sweeping reform to consumer product safety rules, really since the Consumer Product Safety Commission itself was established. And the CPSIA, it's a really broad sweeping, complicated set of regulations, and it was written with Mattel in mind. It was written with the retail world in mind. It was not written with the promotional products industry in mind at all. And so we have unique challenges when it comes to complying with this specific regulation. But here are the high points for CPSIA that you need to keep in mind. The first is it defines a child as being age 12 or younger. And that's hard for us as an industry because if they had defined a child as being 6 or 7, it would give a narrower scope to the rule. But it's a child is 12 years of age or younger, and the regulation itself applies to children's products, child care articles, and children's toys. Now, with our industry, we really have 3 categories of products. We have the category of products that are not and never will be children's products. If you have, maybe a leather pad folio or, an adult backpack or any of those things, those aren't going to be children's items. Then there are those things that are just inherently children's items. They would be toys or baby blankets or children's size apparel. But there's this middle category where it's really mushy for us to wrap our heads around it because in the undecorated state, the item is a general use item, appealing to anyone, regardless of their age. And if you put, say, Sagni on the logo, it remains a general use item appropriate for anyone. But if you replace the Sagni logo with a Dora the Explorer image, all of a sudden it's transformed into a children's product. So that adds an additional level of complication for us as an industry. So the requirements for CPSIA, if it's a children's product, that's an item intended for use by someone 12 or under, children's toy, something a child will interact with at play, or a child care item, which is something that would be designed to help a very young child sleep, eat, or be soothed. These rules apply. First of all, you have to have the product third-party tested. You need to get it tested for lead in the substrate, lead in the paint, some phthalates. You need to create paperwork like a children's product certificate, tracking labels, and some previously voluntary standards become mandatory. And I'm going to go through each of these. And this is the part of the presentation that's really, it's the heaviest lift, it's the most detailed. But we'll go through each of these in turn so you can understand what I'm talking about. So if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so the first one is lead in substrate. You need to get the children's product tested by a third-party CPSC accepted lab to find out how much lead is in the product itself. And that's before you put the surface coating on it. And the product has to contain no more than 100 parts per million of lead. That's not, that's a minuscule amount of lead. And when I talk to labs, items, they usually have high levels of lead or really no lead at all. So the first thing you need to do is get the product tested for lead in substrate. The next test is on the next slide, and it's lead in paint. So if the item, if you can take like a razor blade or an X-Acto knife and scrape the lead off of the paint or the surface coating off the item, that's what would need to be tested for lead in paint. So it's the decorated or scrapable surface coatings. The limit for lead in paint is 90 parts per million. So again, put it in perspective, back in the 50s, standard white house paint was 50% lead. That's how much lead was added to the paint, just in regular white house paint. They dropped that level down over the years, so it's 600 parts per million of lead in 1978. And as a result of CPSIA, we dropped it all the way down to 90 parts per million. So there should not be any lead in the paint itself. Can you go up? There you go. The next thing, so the lead in surface coating and the lead in paint and, lead in substrate and the lead in paint and surface coating, that test is required for all children's items. Phthalate testing is only required for children's toys and child care products. It's an important distinction to keep in mind when you're testing your products because the lead in paint and the lead in substrate test is significantly less expensive than the phthalate test. So what are phthalates besides a ridiculously spelled word? Phthalates are a plasticizing agent. It's a chemical added to plastic to make it flexible, to give it some tensile strength so you can bend it without it snapping. So some items like, say, a double-walled tumbler are unlikely to have any phthalates because it's a hard plastic. You wouldn't want that to be a soft plastic, so you wouldn't deliberately add the phthalates to it. Other items that are more bendable, like Velcro or vinyl in a baby bib, are more likely to have phthalates in them. So there are a number of phthalates that are not allowed to be in the product. It's about 6 of them, and you need to make sure those products are tested to ensure that they do not have those phthalates in the item. And it applies to the accessible materials only. So if you could go to the next slide. There was also an element in the rule that made previously voluntary standards now mandatory, and that would be the ban on small parts. So you can't have small parts on products intended for children under 3, and you need to have a warning if there are small parts in products that are intended for children between 3 and 8 years old. A word on voluntary standards. It's funny that they made these previously voluntary standards mandatory because when you're dealing with product safety, you have to consider all voluntary standards to be mandatory standards. The thought process by it is that the CPSC is looking at everyone to have do their due diligence, exercise due care. When they see a voluntary standard, they expect you to comply with it because it means that's really what everybody is doing. That's where the bar is set. And if you're not at the same level as everyone else, they're going to consider that to be a violation. So just think voluntary standards are always mandatory. So just real quick, third-party testing is required for lead in paint and surface coatings for all products, in substrate for all children's products. There's a ban on phthalates for certain children's toys and child care items, and then the ban on small parts for under 3 and the warning between 3 and 8. Next slide. So that's the testing part of CPSC. So the product needs to be tested, and it needs to be tested before it enters the U.S. stream of commerce. How do you prove that the item was tested? What paperwork is required? Well, that's the Children's Product Certificate on the slide now, the CPC. So if you have a children's product, you have to have the CPC produced before it's imported. You can't create one later. You can't backdate it. You'll get into pretty serious trouble on that one. You need a children's product certificate. Now, the importer or the domestic manufacturer is responsible for the testing and the certification. And the lab will do the testing, and then the supplier or the importer of record is going to create the CPC that documents what happened. So you just, on the CPC, you list the kind of testing that was done. It has to be produced and made available for every use order. And there are sample certificates available on the CPSC website. So if you go to the next slide, these are the elements that are required. It sounds much more complicated than it is, and I have an example of how to do one later in this presentation. But really what you need to do is identify these 7 things on a single sheet of paper. There's no standard format for this, but you need to identify the product, the site, the CPSC, product safety regulation, so lead in paint, lead in substrate, phthalates. You have to identify who the importer or domestic manufacturer is. You have to have contact information for who maintains the test results. It can just be a phone number, an email address. You need to have the date and place where it was manufactured. You don't have to have like the specific address for the factory that produced it, but you want to at least have a code that identifies what factory that produced it. A date and place where it was tested. So wherever the lab was that did the testing, it could be in Hong Kong, it could be in Shenzhen, it could be in Connecticut, and then identify the lab that did the testing. So those are the things that need to be on the form. Now, what's starting to happen is evaluation of compliance with CPSIA really is happening at the border. CPSC is a pretty tiny agency compared to most federal agencies, so they rely heavily on Customs and Border Protection. So when Customs is monitoring the ports and looking at the items that are coming in, when they see a children's product, they are beginning to start checking for the CPC. Now, the CPC needs to be available and accompany each product, but it doesn't have to physically be there. So it may be that the customs agent is going to say to the customs broker, where's the CPC on this? The customs broker is expected to be able to provide it pretty quickly, at least by the next day, deliver the CPC. The challenge is going to come in if the CPC wasn't created in advance of the import, then you can start getting in more trouble. You could start looking at fines. Now, product's not going to get recalled because you don't have the CPC when Customs demands it. But what's going to happen is kind of worse because you're going to be put on what is really considered the naughty list by by Customs and Border Protection. They're going to put that customs broker on a list and say, okay, they're not following the rules, so we have to check everything they do super carefully going forward. And that can result in a lot of delays in getting the shipment done. So for a practical reason, more than anything else, you need to make sure you have that paperwork in order and that you can supply the CPC when it's requested. The other thing that's required, so now we've talked about testing the children's product. We've talked about creating the paperwork for the children's product, that's CPC. The next thing you need to do is make sure it has a tracking label. So tracking label has nothing to do with registering the product somewhere or testing the product. A tracking label is designed to make a recall easier. So when I talk about tracking labels, I often give the example of that jar of peanut butter in your pantry. When peanut butter is recalled, you're told go to your pantry, pull down the peanut butter, and see if the lot number on the peanut butter matches the lot number that's subject to a recall. And if it is, you return it to the store, and if it's not, then you can go ahead and continue to use it. That's what a tracking label is supposed to do. So if there's a recall of a children's product, the CPSC would be able to include in that recall announcement, this is the tracking label that you should be looking for on the product. It allows them in a lot of ways to control the size of the recall, the amount of product that's going to be recalled. It's supposed to give consumers a sense of confidence. This is one of the most problematic areas of complying with the regulation for our industry. So the tracking label itself is actually required for all children's products that have been manufactured since August 14th, 2009. And it's still, a lot of people are surprised that this part of the regulation even exists, but it does. It's designed to enhance recall effectiveness, and there's some required information that needs to be on the tracking label. The manufacturer name, so it's usually the supplier name, month and year of manufacture, city and state of manufacture, batch or internal order number, and the distributor PO number. That's a lot of information to put on a promotional product. Most of the promotional products in this industry are not real big. Many are very small. And they're all about the customer's logo. They're not about all of this information. And all this information detracts from the customer's logo and really makes the promotional product less effective in the eyes of a lot of people. So we have lots of challenges with it. Can you go to the next slide? And these tracking labels, they have to be permanent. So it can't be a sticker, it can't be a hang tag, those aren't acceptable because it's supposed to accompany the product for the life of the product. Now the supplier is going to be putting the tracking label information on the children's product, And depending on changes made to the product, it may need a secondary tracking label. So really what I'm talking about here are T-shirts. If you get a children's size T-shirt and you order that shirt from the supplier, it's got a tracking label on it. And T-shirts they're easy and they're hard. They're easy in that they're sized. So if it's a youth size, it's a children's product. And if it's an adult size, it's a general use item. So you only need tracking labels on youth size T-shirts. And it comes with it already done in the blank state. But then you send that T-shirt to your screen printer down the street, and you have the elementary school logo screen printed onto the shirt for distribution at field day. Well, you're going to actually have a secondary tracking label as to accompany that decoration, because the screen printing process could actually introduce lead into the item. So you need to make sure that the testing is done on the inks, that your screen printer is up to speed on what the regulations are, and then they include that secondary tracking label. So if there was a recall, you would only be recalling those decorated shirts, not every single medium-size red T-shirt from this manufacturer. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. I have lots of problems with it personally. I think in a lot of ways, if you have a T-shirt with an elementary school logo on it and a date in Field Day 2014, you actually know who made it. You can get to your PO, you can get to all of your tracking information, you can get to the school, and you can have a recall happen effectively. But this was not written with our industry in mind, so you need to have all that information on it. So what we did at PPAI was we created a tracking label system that's online. And the goal for this is really to reduce the amount of information you have to add to the product. So you don't have to use ours. There are other systems that other companies have created that are very, very similar to ours. But what we really have is just a set of required elements on the screen that you just fill out. And that way, all you have to do is have the URL, which is ps.ppa.org, / and then the unique identifier you choose. So when we were testing it, we just put in sample 003. If you type that into your search engine, that information below on your screen, that's what's going to show up. Promotional Products Association International with our UPIC, Dallas, the date, the order number, contact information, and a phone number, so that you can go online and get this information rather than putting it all on your product. The only things you would actually need to print on the product, whether it's the secondary imprint for a T-shirt or the primary tracking label that the supplier would put on there, would be ps.ppa.org / sample 003 and your company name. You have to include your company name in addition to the URL. The thought process on that is that when the law was written, they said not everyone has access to the internet. So you need to have the company information on that. I have challenges with that as well, because I believe everybody has access to the internet. It may not be convenient, but everybody in this country can get to the internet. And additionally, for our industry at least, you're not going to be finding any of the suppliers in our industry by looking in a phone book. You're going to be Googling them to get to them anyway. But that's neither here nor there. The rule is the rule, so you have to have the tracking label information on there. And if you choose to use the electronic method, you need the URL plus the company name. And if that's not fun enough going through CPSIA, there are a bunch of other regulations as well, and I'm going to cover a lot of these in the next webinar that we do. But there are regulations, there are FDA regulations for drinkware, sunscreen, cosmetics. There's a Dodd-Frank Act that deals with publicly traded companies and items that come from war-torn areas of the Congo. There's the Lacey Act, which is actually a timber regulation, but it applies to any wooden materials. And then there's state regulations. There's California Prop 65, which I think poses the single biggest financial challenge to this industry. There's rules about cadmium, about packaging, state regulations about lead. There are international standards, and there are more. And it's really important that you know, as painful as it is to go through the process, it's really important that you know what these regulations are so you can make sure you're doing your due diligence to comply with them. So if you could go to the next slide. So when it comes to CPSIA, here are some of the things that cause me the greatest concern. The first one, and I spoke about this a little bit at the beginning, is that a juvenile imprint can transform a general use item into a children's product. So you take the example of the double-walled tumbler. One of the former general counsels with the CPSC had a great line. He called it the mortification rule. If you would be mortified to use a particular product in a business setting or in a business meeting, then it's clearly a children's product. So a double-walled tumbler that says Sagni on it is a general use item. A double-walled tumbler that's blank is a general use item. But if the double-walled tumbler contains, Barney or Dora the Explorer, you're not going to be using that in a business setting. You're just not. That becomes a children's product. And it's particularly challenging for our industry because a supplier is not necessarily going to be testing a double-walled tumbler as a children's product because in its undecorated state it isn't, and they don't have to test it. But when you add the logo, even though nothing's changed, the tumbler is the same, the manufacturing process is the same, the supplier is the same, the ink that's being applied and the imprint is the same, but by applying that really juvenile imprint, you can potentially make it a children's product, and then all of a sudden it's subject to testing. And you as a distributor you have an in-hand date, it's a rush order, you need this to happen quickly, you sent your PO to the supplier and you give them the logo. Well, they're on the line, that's when they realize this is a children's product, it's not tested, what are we going to do now? So that kind of communication up front is incredibly important. And I'll show you some tools to help make that a little easier for you, but you need to make sure that you're asking your customer, who is this going to? Is this product intended for children? And if it is, you need to be telling the supplier because the supplier has an obligation to make sure the testing is done, but they can't do that if they don't know that it's going to become a children's product. So have that conversation with them. Very often a supplier will, most suppliers in this industry do not classify many of their products as children's products because they aren't. They may test a few of them. So a drawstring backpack is a good example here, that a drawstring backpack in its undecorated state is a general use item. They may have 5 different SKUs of drawstring backpacks, and they may have designated one as a children's product and got the testing done, and that one may be a little bit more expensive since they had the extra costs associated with the testing. But just talk to them and tell them it's going to be intended for children. I need this kind of logo. What do you have in your line that's CPSIA compliant? It's that kind of communication that's really important. Discovering the intended audience can be super difficult. It can be virtually impossible for the supplier. That's, again, where the communication has to happen. You want to make sure you have the paperwork. You want to ask for the CPC. The supplier needs to make that CPC available. And you need to make sure you're checking the test report that the CPC is based on. So the children's product certificate is the document the supplier importer creates based on the test report. You need to be looking at the test report. The test report, the testing needs to happen once a year. So testing for CPSIA needs to happen annually. There's a few exceptions to the annual rule, but not many. And it's testing during the manufacturing process. So if you have a steady run of double-walled tumblers, you're going to want to get it tested every single year. And if something changes, like you change factories or you change raw material sources, you're going to need to retest when those things happen. That rule's in place really because of Mattel and the white paint, because Mattel, even if they were testing those products, which they did not have to do at the time that their recalls happened, based on this rule, you would have to retest when you change the supplier of that white paint, so they would have caught that white paint before they had millions of products recalled. So testing needs to happen annually. So ask for the test report, make sure you get the test report, make sure it's the right test report, make sure it's based on the product that you're actually getting and not a completely different item. And the last thing, and this is more of a California Prop 65 issue than anything else, but the distribution site for the product is often unknown to the manufacturer. So You may not know the product is going to California, but once it gets to California, if you're not complying with Prop 65 standards, you could be subject to pretty serious penalties and fines. And we'll talk about that in the next webinar as well. So how do you determine if something is a children's product? Well, there are a bunch of rules, and you can go to the next slide and kind of talk about it there, that were set up, but they're set up with the retail model in mind. So for us, it's not where the product is in the store or, particular advertising or, focus groups that we're doing as an industry. It's, is the product, look at the mortification rule. Would you be mortified to be seen wearing or using this product as an adult? If so, it's a children's product. So if you look at this slide, everything on this slide is a children's product. And it's obvious it is because of the logos, because of the item itself. You can go to the next slide. Some things are transformed into children's items that in their undecorated state they're not, and depending on the decoration, it can become a children's product or it can become very clearly a general use item. Other things can have exactly the same logo, but they're not necessarily a children's product. So you take the mouse pad, and the mouse pad, is not going to be a children's product in its undecorated state. If you put the Flintstones on it, though, it could well be considered a children's product. But if you put the Flintstones on a check is inherently not a children's product. It's a general use item. So it's just common sense more than anything else when you're trying to determine whether or not something is a children's product. T-shirts are a great example. If you go forward one, the other T-shirt's going to appear. And T-shirts, it's about size. If it's an adult-size T-shirt, it's a general use item. If it's a youth-size T-shirt, and I don't care if it even goes to youth 16, then you consider it a children's item, and you just get it tested based on the size. So that part's simple, and also you don't need a ton of tests for T-shirts because most of them are just cotton or a poly-cotton blend. The challenge with the T-shirts is the imprint and the resulting tracking label more than anything else. Drawstring backpacks, I had a really interesting conversation years and years ago at the expo. We were talking about product safety, and it was the real beginning, right after CPSIA happened. And a gentleman in the audience said, well, I have a drawstring backpack. Is it a children's item? And we said, well, is it, a bright color? Nope, it's navy blue. Is it a small size? He said, nope, it's a standard size drawstring backpack. Does it have a juvenile imprint? Nope, it's just the logo for the hotel. And we are all saying, yeah, that's a general use item. And he said, but wait, it's only given out to the kids club members at the hotel. They only give it out to people under the age of 12. And we all said, you know what, then that makes all the difference in the world, because now you have to have a different conversation with your client. You need to go back to the client and say, well, if you're giving this out to the kids, you should consider making sure that it's tested for compliance with CPSIA, because you're intending to give it only to children under the age of 12. So again, that goes back to really being able to differentiate yourself from the competition by pointing out hazards to your client that your competitors aren't pointing out, and adding more value and setting yourself apart by having a different level of discourse with your client than perhaps other people can have. So if you go to the next slide, we have drinkware here. And again, it's that kind of, some are totally obvious that they're children's products. You're looking at them, you're going, yeah, obviously the top two are children's products. Applebee's, depending on the size, if it's a standard size, I'd say it's a general use item. If it would be a super small size, you might consider it a children's product. And Dunbar Band, I'm going to talk about this more when we get to the slide with the pens. That one could go either way. I would consider it a children's product to be safe. Stress relievers. Frankly, I have no idea. I don't think anybody does. It depends on the item itself and how much play value it has, whether you would consider it a children's item or not. A lot of people consider them to be executive desk toys. A lot of them consider them to be children's products. You're just going to need to work with a really reputable supplier who's got this one figured out, because there have been no definitions made by the CPSC on what is or what isn't. I just think it depends on the item, how appealing it is to children. You know, if maybe the rubber duck, maybe the teddy bear would be considered a children's item, and the beer would be a general use item, but you have to have the conversations with your clients and just proceed carefully on that one and make sure you know who the intended audience is. If you go to the next slide, really all of these I would consider to be children's products, the Rubik's Cube, because it is a toy, but most keychains are going to be general use items. It's going to be the exceptions that would be children's products. Sporting equipment is another, thing to consider because it depends on really the size of the item. Another thing that the CPSC relies on would be the cost of the item. I think I get to that in a later slide as well. But that doesn't help us in the promotional products industry a whole lot because a lot of the items in this industry are fairly inexpensive and given away free of charge, so we can't rely on that. So you have to just look at the positioning, the marketing, and the size. If you go to the next slide, the soccer balls are a really good way of considering this because the soccer balls are actually sized by age. There's 12 and up, clearly, generally, well, over 12 is a general use item. So the size balls 1 through 4 would be considered children's products and have to be tested. Size 5 and up, or size 5 would be a general use item. So you just want to look at the size of the product, who is it intended for. If it has a logo of Little Gem on it, it's going to be a children's item. And then executive desk toys. I kind of talked about that a bit before as well. And those I would consider to be general use items. They're not intended for children. They're not marketed towards children. They're not something that children would, typically interact with. They're executive desk toys. And this is a good example of what I was saying earlier about the price point. Model train enthusiasts actually petitioned the CPSC to have an exclusion for those trains because they said they're not children's products. They're very expensive. They're collectible. They do have lead in a lot of the intricate parts. And the CPSC acknowledged the validity of that statement and said, yeah, you know what, you're right. Those are not children's products. The same thing applies to those really expensive collectible dolls. They're not intended for children. They're intended for adult collectors. But the toys on the top of the screen are clearly going to be intended for children. So, little model cars, little model trains. If you have, a car and a keychain that's a promotional product being sold to an automotive dealer, they would be considered children's products and need to be tested accordingly. Now, pens are a unique category because pens were a big question mark for the CPSC because the ball in a ballpoint pen does contain lead. And it contains lead levels in excess of CPSIA requirements. And there's not a good alternative to the ball in the ballpoint pen right now. So what we did is we and the Writing Instrument Manufacturers Association approached the CPSC with a petition to exclude pens from needing to comply with the CPSC. Interesting on that one is that the CPSC came back and denied us our request for exclusion, but gave us something else called what is commonly referred to as the WEMA rule. And it was a statement written by the General Counsel for the CPSC at the time saying pens should be considered general use items. And even if that pen is sold in the school store or the back-to-school bin at a supermarket or a big store, even if that pen has the logo or the name of the school on it, it's still a general use item because it is appealing to teachers and parents and students alike. It is not intended primarily for use by children. Instead, it's a general use item. So they made a really good rule on that. If you add high play value to the pen, however, it changes. So, you see the little operation pen there, or you see the kind of Rubik's Cube kind of pen there, that can transform it into a children's product. But in most cases, you do not need to worry about pens. And so if you're going to add the play value to the pens, just make sure you're using a felt tip pen and not a ballpoint pen. The other thing to keep in mind are the marketing statements you make. So here are like flash drives and USB drives. Now, in most cases, flash drives and USB drives are not considered to be children's products. They would be considered general use items. But if you make a marketing statement like flash drives for kids and that's what you call all of your products, flash drives for kids, they would become a children's product because of the marketing statement you made. So when you're marketing, just be careful. Don't say something's perfect for kids unless you're sure that it's been tested and then it complies with CPSIA. If you go to the next slide, you also don't want to show images of kids interacting with the product because, again, you're making that marketing statement that it's intended for kids. So, the juggling kit, it could be a general use item, but when you see the kid interacting with it, then you're making a statement that it's intended for the child. So just be aware of that. Try to avoid images of kids in your advertising or marketing statements saying that something is intended primarily for them. Another big focus for the CPSC right now would be on drawstrings. It's been a rule for a while that you cannot have drawstrings on children's upper outerwear. It poses a significant hazard, getting caught in a school bus door or something like that. First of all, drawstrings don't really serve any real purpose. You're never going to see a kid tying their drawstring to keep their hood on their head. So it doesn't benefit anything. It doesn't serve a useful function, and it is the easiest thing for customs to catch when a product's coming over. So if they see drawstrings on children's upper outerwear jackets or sweatshirts, they're going to stop it. They're going to stop it at the border, or they're going to make sure the recall happens right away. They don't need a complicated test. They don't need an XRF gun. They can just see it. So just avoid drawstrings. There are some pretty hefty penalties that I've seen in recent months and recent years, and from big companies too. And the Burlington Coat Factory, I think they've had 3 recalls on drawstrings in upper outerwear. I know Macy's had one a couple of years ago. So just be aware of that and avoid the drawstrings on children's upper outerwear. So that would be jackets, sweatshirts. It would include around the waistband on jackets, as well as there are regulations about the waistband on pants. So I told you where you could find the resources. They're on our PPAI site. We have just a ton of information there. We have best practices. We have guides that go through everything we've done with the CPSC. We have frequently asked questions. We have a lot of really good resources. And even for our best practices, we do webinars every 2 weeks, and we try to turn each of those webinars into a best practice so that you can spend the hour listening to the webinar, which usually hopefully helps a lot, but then you can get the best practice, and that kind of summarizes in writing the key points so that you don't have to listen to an hour-long webinar to get a question. You can just go to the best practice and scan it and then find the thing that you're looking for. If you go to the next slide, talk a little bit about TurboTest, I think. Oh, no. This one's talking about more about the information that's on our website, things like our Product Safety Aware program. Like I said, this is one of the required elements in the Product Safety Aware program. But when you go through this, when you complete all 4 hours, you can get the logo that you can put on your website, and just tons of information on those 2 pages on our website. So if you go to the next one, this is TurboTest. Now, TurboTest is, it was created by PPAI specifically for our industry. And what it does is, the name sounds like TurboTax because it's the same kind of philosophy of we walk you through a series of yes-no questions to take something really complicated and give you something that's a lot more manageable at the end. So it's like, in its undecorated state, is this product a children's item? Yes, no, or I don't know. And those are the kinds of things that you ask, and you kind of go through a decision tree. So if you go to the next slide, by the time you finish going through the whole program, this is the slide I was talking about. In its undecorated state, is it considered a children's product? If you go to the next slide, when you finish going through all the questions, you're going to get a list of the things to consider when evaluating whether or not it's a children's product, links to the CPSC, and then on the next slide, okay, so now after going through this, these are the things that you need to consider. So if you said it's a children's product but it's not apparel, these are the kind of things that you're going to have to test for. So it's very useful. It's not, it's not legal guidance or anything like that. But it's good when distributors are talking to suppliers so you get an understanding of what your compliance obligations are. And it's good for suppliers when they're sourcing new products. They can just, bounce the new product against the regulations to make sure that they have everything covered and that they're not putting themselves or their clients at risk. So It's online. It's completely free of charge. You can use it as much or as little as you'd like. It's there just to help make your life a little bit easier. Now, the other thing I said earlier when I was talking about compliance documents was you have to be able to create your certificate of compliance. And when you first start looking at the certificate of compliance or the testing documentation, it might as well be written in Greek because it doesn't make any sense to someone who's not really intimately familiar with this. So what we tried to do is we tried to have, just call out bubbles for all the elements to kind of explain this is what this means. This is what you need to be looking for. So this is how to read a compliance document, and it just really walks you through all that stuff. And this one would be considered a good report, and then we also have examples, I think, on the next slide of a bad report, and we have, bad information on that slide so that you can compare the two side by side. So when you're looking at a CPS, Children's Product Certificate or a test report, you know what you're looking for, and you know what would be considered not acceptable. That's on our website as well. It's completely free. You can use it as much as you'd like. You could go to the next one. This document is kind of a worksheet. It's intended for use by distributors, and it's to help you have that product safety conversation with your client. I know that if, as a salesperson, you want to stop talking as soon as you get the order. You don't want to start putting levels of doubt or question in with your customer when you're going through the program. So this document helps by, giving you a better sense of confidence on how to have that conversation with the client. And it's also going to help differentiate you again from your competition because you're asking them questions that the competition isn't asking. And it's important to get the answers to these questions and then share those answers with the supplier. So who's the intended audience of your campaign? Is it children or adults? Will or could the items be distributed to children? How will the products be distributed? Where? Do you plan on distributing all the items or keeping some for future events? A lot of clients, they have their promotional products closet where they put everything for every event. Well, if that's how they work, that's fine. But you want to make sure that that closet is stocked only with general use items or only with products that comply with CPSIA so you don't get into challenges down the road. If you go to the next slide, just a few things to kind of summarize the presentation. First, most pens are general use items. Think before you include a picture of a child interacting with the item on the website or in your advertising, because then you're making that implicit statement that it's intended for children. Look for tracking labels. Whenever I'm looking at products, if I think an item is a children's item, first thing I'm going to look for is a tracking label. And it takes a little practice to find it because there's no one size fits all. They're all a little different, but once you get used to it, you can always find the tracking label. If I don't find a tracking label, I know that product is not fully compliant because they missed an important step. Now, if I see a tracking label, that doesn't prove that they've had it tested and it doesn't prove they have a CPC. But I would be completely aware that a product that's a children's item that doesn't have a tracking label is not compliant. So look for the tracking label. That's going to be your first clue, and then ask for the CPC. Test reports need to include pictures of the item. Drawstrings, no drawstrings on children's upper outerwear. And I always get the question after that, what about drawstring backpacks? Those are different. Drawstring bags are a different product entirely. They are it's completely acceptable to have drawstrings in the drawstring bag, not on children's upper outerwear. Ask your screen printer for tests on their inks. When you're working with it, when you become a contract decorator, you get that shirt and you send it to the contract decorator, the screen printer to decorate it. It needs a secondary tracking label. And even if the item's a general use item, there may be some regulations beyond CPSIA, things like California Prop 65. So if you could go to the next slide. I know I went through this quickly. It was a lot of information to get through in an hour, and I hope I didn't speak too quickly or confuse anyone, but I would be more than happy to answer any questions you have now. And if you have any questions later, I'd be happy to answer those as well. And I want to thank Jonathan and District 1 for giving me this opportunity to share a lot of this information with all of you. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ann. I'm going to click off of this screen so I can get this back to see what questions there are. Bear with me for 1 second. I apologize. Okay, there. Okay, sorry about that. Trying to get the questions to load so I can read them. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, there are a bunch of questions. Question, as a screen printer, do I need to create a label for each separate design on kids' t-shirts?
The short answer to that is probably yes. Because there are a couple of ways people apply the secondary label to the decoration. One is to have 2 screens. And you don't want to do that because you're touching it twice and it costs twice because you have to create 2 screens. In most cases, you can incorporate the tracking label into the design itself. Now, that's not going to work if you're using, a Nike swoosh or a corporate logo of some sort. But if you're doing an elementary school imprint, just include the tracking label as part of the image that you're imprinting. It can be the same color as the ink in the imprint itself. It doesn't need to stand out or be apart from that. In the smallest fonts you can, that's legible. And that's going to be the easiest way to do it. But you're going to need to have a tracking label on each screen printed shirt that you do for children's products.
Okay, another question that was asked, I believe, more of a statement, I believe water-based ink printing does not need to be tested. Is that true?
That is true. The CPSIA calls it the CMYK printing process, and it's that water-based paper press-on almost kind of imprinting, and you're right, that does not need to go through third-party testing.
Question, as far as products we make in Canada, like baby bibs, baby blankets, baby beanies, from what I understand, textiles doesn't need lead testing. Please advise for printing or decoration method of screen print versus embroidery what needs to be tested.
Okay. So the apparel itself many times does not need to be tested because it's considered exempt because it's cotton or a cotton poly blend. If you're talking about child care items or even children's products, if you have a zipper, that would need to be tested for lead. If you have the zipper and it's coated with a surface coating to make it match the color of a hoodie or something like that, that surface coating also needs to be tested. If you have a onesie, you would need to make sure if it had snaps, that the snaps were tested for lead. If the snaps had surface coating on them, they were tested for the surface coating. If you have a baby bib that maybe has a vinyl backing, it's a child care item, so it would need to be tested for phthalates. Embroidery, most embroidery is exempt from third-party testing because they're natural fibers. Some metal threads or specialty threads would need to go through third-party testing. Most of the time they do not. As a best practice, if you just went with standard cotton thread or something like that, you'd be good without testing, but you would still need the tracking label for all of these items, even if they're exempt from testing. We have one best practice on our website specifically addresses all the different decorating methods and spells out what tests are required for one item. The last thing I would say is that there are Canadian regulations and U.S. regulations, and they're not completely harmonized, which means that there's some differences between the 2 tests. Particularly phthalates is a different test in Canada than it is in the U.S. So your items that you're selling in Canada need to comply with the Canadian standards. Any items that you're exporting to the U.S. would need to comply with the U.S. standards.
Okay, a couple of more questions have come in. On products that are bought from a U.S.-based company, what documents do we need to have on hand? And if we get the product from one supplier and the inks from another, do you need separate documents?
So The way CPSIA is written, it doesn't differentiate between domestic manufacturers and overseas manufacturers. So even if you're a domestic manufacturer, you still need to follow all the same rules that you would have to follow if you were using an overseas manufacturer. So that would be the first thing. You would need to have the product, if it's a children's product, tested by a third-party lab to all applicable standards, create the CPC, the Children's Product Certificate, have the test report accompany the CPC, and apply a tracking label. And what was the second part of the question?
Do they need separate documents if the product comes from one supplier and the ink comes from another?
Well, you want to make sure the inks are tested, and you want to make sure the products are tested. Now, you can have, so I just want to make sure people don't get confused on this, because in the beginning there was some confusion about this. If you are a distributor and you're ordering a decorated mug from a supplier, you would be asking for one CPC from that supplier, and they would provide it to you. Now, they could very easily have two test reports done, one for the mug and one for the ink. It's called component part rules. You can test the pieces and parts, and as long as you have test reports for all the pieces and parts, you can create a single CPC that relies on the multiple tests.
Okay. Does the label on glass products need to be applied to the product or the packaging, was the question.
Okay. So for tracking labels for all items, the rule states that you need to apply the tracking label to the product and its packaging. But if the product does not come with packaging, you do not need to create packaging to go with it. And then there are also some exclusions on tracking labels that if it's not practicable, which is the term the CPSC uses for it, if it's not practicable to apply a tracking label, then you aren't obligated to do so. So if it's like 14-karat jewelry, you wouldn't have to do it because it would diminish the beauty of the product, I guess. Or if it's a very, very small item, or if it's like a mesh item that you couldn't imprint. But the challenge for our industry is we know we can imprint anything, and we do all day long. So it makes it almost impossible for us to rely on that rule.
And does PPAI have a list of testing labs that they can make available to suppliers or distributors?
Yes. We have a link. So the CPSC has a list of their accepted labs. And labs are accepted based on specific tests they do. There's not, there's not one kind of big list of everybody. We do have a bunch of labs I'm happy to recommend to anyone in the industry. If you just give me a call, I'll help you figure it out. I would say whenever you're looking for a lab, it really helps to work with a lab that has a U.S. presence. Most testing costs are going to be 60% cheaper if you do it overseas, and you're also testing it before you're importing it, so it saves a lot of money to get the product tested overseas. But you want to have usually a U.S.-based contact because it's going to make just the communication back and forth when there are questions a whole lot easier. We have a business partner relationship with UL, Underwriters Laboratory. They're based in Connecticut, and they give, I believe, a 20% discount to all PPAI members. But there are a bunch of really good labs, so give me a call, or you can just look on the website. We have a list of all the accepted, a link to the CPSC list of accepted labs.
Okay, there are a couple more questions. One question's come up several times. How do we get a copy of these slides? And I assume it's okay with you for me to forward it to people if they ask for it?
Absolutely.
So if you email info@sagny.org, SAAGNY.org, we will be happy to send you the PowerPoint presentation. Question that was asked, are these requirements already in full effect? Are they only in the early adoption stage? When must we be 100% compliant?
August 14th, 2009. So yes, CPSC, it came into effect on August 15th, 2008. And it kind of gradually rolled in a lot of the things. Like tracking labels was a year later, third-party testing was a year later. But as of now, it's a mature regulation. They're enforcing it. We're seeing a lot more scrutiny at the border with customs, looking for things like CPCs, looking for things like the tracking labels. Enforcement is happening at the ports. Civil penalties are way up, and it is absolutely fully in effect now. So if you're dealing with children's products, you need to make sure you're complying with these regulations.
There was a question asked, if I'm ordering products from manufacturers listed in SAGE, do I need to worry about having these products tested, or have these companies already supplied their CPCs in order to be listed in SAGE?
You do not need to provide a CPC to be listed in SAGE. You should always be doing your due diligence and your due care, and there's an expectation from the CPSC that everyone should be doing so. You know, even if you're putting a policy in place that says, okay, this is how we're going to do this going forward, it makes a lot of sense to just have a memo to file, just create a little bit of a paper trail for yourself, explaining how you exercise due care or explaining what you went through when you were setting a new policy. But no, companies listed in SAGE do not have to provide any sort of CPC for children's products. So you're going to want to ask them proactively, show me your CPC. We're requiring all companies that want to do business, all suppliers that want to do business through PPAI channels, through exhibiting Expo East, advertising in our publications, exhibiting at Expo starting this spring, to go through product safety aware training, which means that someone, at least one person on the staff, has to have a basic understanding of product safety awareness through taking 4 classes, and this is one of them. There's no test at the end, but you have to at least have a basic understanding so that you have a greater degree of confidence when talking about these rules. But it still relies on suppliers and distributors exercising their due care and saying, if it's a children's product, I need to see the CPC and show me the test report, and how do you handle tracking labels.
And I think the last question, do UV inks need to be tested?
I do not know the answer to that. I will look into it. I know. I don't know. I would think they would need to be tested, but I don't know.
Someone just posted that they're VOC free, but hopefully you know what VOC free means.
I do, and that isn't going to get around the CPSC requirement. The CMYK printing process is exempt because it's that water-based, paper-based process, but ink-based, they're pretty strict about that. And we had hoped to get some wiggle room on that, but there was actually a recall, I think about 18 months ago now, in Canada for some T-shirts that the T-shirts were manufactured in Mexico, I believe, and shipped to Canada, where they were decorated by a screen printer. Somehow lead got into the printing process, and they were tested, and they were found to have high levels of lead in those shirts and in the ink itself. So we're not going to see any relief on that side. I don't see it any time in the near future.
Okay. There have been a couple of comments about CMYK and that not all CMYK is water-based, and CTK and is any full-color CMYK. I think some of this is getting pretty specific, that perhaps if it's okay with you, I can refer the people to contact you directly.
Yeah, I would welcome that, because I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert when it comes to the different kinds of inks. We do have a guide that talks specifically for each decorating method, what you need to test, how you need to test. So just reach out to me, and I'll make sure I show you where that document is, and then you can look through it, and it defines all the different the different process there. And you know what? I'll send it directly to you as well, Jonathan, so you'll have it.
Perfect. Okay, and then the last question that someone asked was, when are parts 2, 3, and 4? Part 2 will deal with Prop 65 and state regulations. That will be on Thursday, December 18th. Part 3 is undue influence training. That will be Thursday, January 22nd, 2015. And Part 4 will focus on apparel, and that will be on February 19th, 2015. I think that's also a Thursday. So unless there are any additional questions, Anne, thank you very much. This was very informative. I think it was a great webinar. Thank you to everybody who joined in and participated. And we will see you at the next webinar in December.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.